Welcome to Fight News Now Extra. I'm your host, John Pollock, with John Ramsey joining me in a few minutes as we are going to chat about a major breakthrough for the UFC in Australia and more fights to announce for the UFC's debut in the Philippines and the big UFC 187 card happening over Memorial Day weekend. The UFC has announced that Gegard Mousasi will meet Costas Philippou on the May 16th card in the Philippines underneath the main event between Frankie Edgar and Uriah Faber. Mousasi is coming off a quick stoppage of Dan Henderson from this past January, while Philippou hasn't fought since last May, knocking out Lorenz Larkin. The UFC 187 card continues to grow for the May 23rd show in Las Vegas. The latest addition to the card will see welterweights Josh Burkman and Dong-Hyun Kim collide. Burkman returned to the UFC this past January and dropped a decision to Hector Lombard, but it's expected that that fight will be changed to a no contest after Lombard failed his post-fight drug test. Kim is coming off a loss to Tyron Woodley from last August. And a ministerial directive has been pushed through in the state of Victoria in Australia, allowing for cage fighting to be legalized and opening the door for the UFC to run a major pay-per-view event in the city of Melbourne this November. The promotion was able to run in certain parts of Australia, but this law opens up a significant portion of the country. UFC 193 will take place in Melbourne on Sunday, November the 15th in Australia, so that the show can air on a Saturday night in North America. And we look ahead to our next preview show. It's coming at you Saturday, March 14th, 7 p.m. Eastern, as we will be getting you set for the UFC 185 card in Dallas with two title fights. Anthony Pettis meets Rafael Dos Anjos, and Carlos Esparza defends her strawweight title against Joanna Jędrzejczyk. And I'm here with John Ramsey, fishing for some sponsorship dollars here from Headrush.
Yeah, they hooked me up.
Can't blame a man for trying. We have a number of topics to discuss, and you know, the last couple of days, everything has been focused on UFC 184, what's next for Ronda Rousey, Chris Cyborg, and kind of lost in all that was the Bellator card, and maybe that's just a byproduct of being on Friday night on a show on a weekend that featured a major UFC card. There was a great fight, especially the main event. Liam McGeary wins the Bellator Light Heavyweight Championship from Emmanuel Newton. A very close fight. I very much want to see a rematch, and I think that opening round was as good a round as we've seen this year. The year is still very early, but what did you think of Liam McGeary's performance, and did you feel he won the fight?
Yeah, I did, but what I like about McGeary is that Bellator doing the right thing. They're developing their own stars, and this is very, very important for them because, as you saw, you know, yes, Scott Coker has been very public that he'll go out and try to bring in the biggest stars. Brock Lesnar, Fedor Emelianenko. But the biggest thing for the Bellator organization is to have the stars that are developed in Bellator stay at Bellator. Because we saw Quentin Jackson make the move from the UFC to compete in Bellator. And as soon as the opportunity presented itself, Rampage bailed, and we know that Bellator has their lawsuit against Rampage trying to prevent him from competing in Montreal. Well, obviously we'll have to wait to see the result of that, but I think Bellator is kind of doing the things that they need to do. They're looking outside, trying to bring in the best talent, and they have to find fighters that are going to be able to compete with the guys currently on their roster. McGeary is one of those guys, and it just comes down to creating interest. The fight was so close that you can have a rematch, and hopefully the organization can create that interest so people, the fans that might have not known who McGeary was, they now do. The problem is you look at, there are not a lot of big names. Like, you look at this fight, so you're trying to build these guys up to be superstars. And that's going to be a long road for them.
Well, I see three tiers of fighters in Bellator at the moment. You have the ones that are largely your big names that are going to bring in the most amount of eyeballs. Then you have your second tier, which I would classify as your Liam McGeary's, Brandon Halsey's, guys that are tremendous fighters that are hopefully going to provide that substance. Will Brooks.
They become Will Brooks, yeah.
And then we have that kind of third tier of guys that are coming up, that are underneath, that you're trying to create into that level where they can fit into tier 1 or tier 2. And I think it's a sound business strategy for them. I think the monthly format is already paying dividends. You get that anticipation factor, and I think that you absorb it a lot more. It's not just the suddenly here is show number 3 in a stretch of 9 straight weeks of cards. I think now we look, March 27th is their next card. You have time to digest what you've seen, anticipate what's coming up, and they've given you big fights. I mean, you can say what you will about Ken Shamrock, Kimbo Slice.
I love it. What are you talking about? Like, they have to use this Ken Shamrock, Kimbo Slice fight like the UFC did with the Ultimate Fighter. Use it as a freak show and then load the undercard or your main card with serious fights for the casual. I mean, this main event, Ken Shamrock and Kimbo, that's designed for the casual fans. This is so we can get as many eyeballs as humanly possible tuning into our product. And then they've got to do what they did like with Michael Chandler and Eddie Alvarez, get the eyeballs there and then have the supporting cast thrill the fans so they'll come back over and over again.
We got a couple of fights to announce. Gegard Mousasi and Costas Philippou. They have been added to the Philippines card May the 16th, which will feature Frankie Edgar and Uriah Faber. I think with Gegard Mousasi right now, he is somebody that we have seen flashes of brilliance at 185 pounds. If this guy can get on a bit of a streak, I think he's right below that kind of that section of contenders. Your Jacare's, your Yoel Romero's, Luke Rockhold's.
That's a serious division, though. When you look at the top end of 185 pounds, you have Chris Weidman as your champion. Many people might say that the number 2 guy is either Luke Rockhold or Lyoto Machida. We'll find out the answer after those guys battle it out. Then Jacare, then Romero, and then it's pretty much wide open. There's a very, I'm not going to say there's a gap, but I think Mousasi fits in very, very nicely there. And just the possible matchups that you would have for a guy like Mousasi, like a fight between Michael Bisping and Gegard Mousasi would be absolutely outstanding. But I understand you want to showcase him. Costa Philippou had his chance. Luke Rockhold took him out. Now it's Mousasi's time to shine in the UFC, and I think they're giving him this main event fight for him to go out and showcase his abilities so that they can reinsert him into that title picture.
That Philippines card, it's going to happen on May the 16th. That same weekend, the UFC, some double header time. They're also going to be running a card in Australia that weekend, and a big law being passed where now they can allow cage fighting in the state of Victoria, and mainly to get into Melbourne, which has always been believed to be the hotbed when it comes to mixed martial arts in Australia. Lots of people from Melbourne have traveled to Sydney and other parts of the country when the UFC has gone there. And this has been a big task that Tom Wright and the staff there in Australia have been pushing for. This was not something overnight. They had to do a lot of education for the people in Australia to convince them to allow for fighting to take place inside of a cage, where they were indoctrinated that you fight in a ring. I think that this could lead to a massive stadium show. They've already announced UFC 193, and probably it'll be Dockland Stadium, which we're talking 55,000 or so that they could sell out.
Yeah, it makes sense. The only problem is you got to develop the talent. And I know the fans in Australia, they love mixed martial arts, so it doesn't matter who the main eventer is. But if you can get yourself an Australian fighter, it would only make... If Elvis Sinasek, if this was his day, it would be a huge stadium show, but that's not going to happen.
Well, it could have been if he didn't run into Tito Ortiz in 2001. All right, for John Ramdeen, I'm John Pollock. More Fight News Now Extra is coming up. Stay tuned.